Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We will be beginning our presentation now. So I know there's a few people still filtering in, but that's okay. Everybody just confirming has their mic muted. Perfect. So again, thank you everybody for taking the time out of your lunch to join us for another part of our webinar series. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us and hosting this webinar series. Today's webinar is presented by Stephanie McFarland in conjunction with Holland Bloorview. Holland Bloorview is a kids rehabilitation hospital concussion center that has entered into collaboration with Ontario Soccer about 3 years ago. This collaboration's goal is to enhance youth soccer player safety both on and off the field through education and training, research, policy and protocol, and implementation and access to care. Holland Bloorview is the largest pediatric concussion center in Canada and focuses primarily on youth and the youth brain, as the youth brains are still developing and require a unique approach to concussion care. Their center includes clinicians specifically trained in pediatric brain injury and researchers who are leading experts in the field of youth concussion. And today's webinar is hosted by Stephanie McFarland. Stephanie is currently working as an occupational therapist in the Holland Bloorview Concussion Center's clinical program. She supports youth and families with symptom management, return to school and return to sports procedures after concussion injuries. Stephanie also leads the school and sport partnerships of the Concussion Center. She consults with local, provincial, and national sport and school organizations on the concussion strategy to ensure consistency with best practice guidelines, provincial legislations, and successful implementation at the ground level. So again, thank you, Stephanie, for taking the time today to present this webinar, which will outline the latest evidence surrounding concussion identification, management, and prevention in youth, as well as an update on Rowan's law and provincial legislation surrounding concussions, a walkthrough on how to implement concussion protocols at the grassroots level in sport, describing key stakeholders in ensuring the implementation of remove from sport and return to sport policies, as well as resources for coaches, parents, and players after concussions. Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe throughout the webinar presentation, there are 3 allocated question periods. For any attendees, if you have any questions as the webinar progresses, please submit them into the question box, and as Stephanie's presentation goes to the question period, I'll pass those along for answers. So I now pass it on to you, Steph.
Great. Thanks for the great introduction, and hello everyone. Thanks for coming today. If you have a moment, it may be helpful for me if you're able just to type into the chat box just your role within Ontario Soccer. Just might help me get a bit of an idea of the type of audience I'm talking to today to sort of tailor it to your needs. So if you have a moment over the next bit while I'm doing a brief introduction, just feel free to type in that chat box sort of your primary role, and that'll help me throughout the presentation. So I already spoke to myself, but just a reminder, my name is Stephanie McFarland. I'm an occupational therapist. I work clinically with kids with concussion as my primary role, with children and teens, but I also work in the community, basically making sure that sports organizations and school organizations are supported in their concussion strategies and making the linkages from what we see clinically and in research to the community. So here's a brief outline of what today looks like. So part 1 is just going to be 20 minutes of brief concussion education, just to give you sort of the bare bones. What we want to spend most of our time on today is the part 2 piece, which is there's a new Canada Soccer concussion policy that's been sent out, and often these policies live online, but it's difficult to implement them at the grassroots level. So I hope what you get out of today is some tools to sort of support you with that. We've done these types of sessions for mandatory for some organizations. So to give you some background, we've done them for the Greater Toronto Hockey League every single year, mandated to support these types of implementation. We've also been doing it across the Toronto Soccer Association as well. So today we're hoping to sort of broaden that beyond these realms to give you the tools to support your clubs or teams. So this was already talked about, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but Holland Bloorview is Canada's largest kids rehab hospital. We specialize in youth concussion. We have clinicians specifically trained in pediatric brain injury, as well as a research team to support leading research in the field. Our main focus is getting kids back to what they need, want, and love to do. And if you're in the Toronto area, we're actually just south of Sunnybrook, near Bayview and Eglinton is our location. Also already mentioned, but just a reminder that we do have a 3-year collaboration with Ontario Soccer. We also work with the Greater Toronto Hockey League, Ontario Basketball, and Rugby Ontario as our primary sports partners to support all of the things that you see listed here. We always like to start off by saying, youth sport participation is extremely important and has a positive impact on development. We all know this, but sport teaches kids teamwork, dedication, resilience, and confidence. There is some risk that come with participating in sport. We just want to make sure kids are as safe as possible while they play, but our main goal at the end of the day is to keep kids as active as they can be. So always like to start off with some concussion statistics. At this point, what we know is that concussions can happen in any activity. They don't just happen in sport. I would say about 30 to 45% of the concussions we see here clinically didn't happen in sport. They just happened in day-to-day life. But you are 6 times more likely to experience concussion from organized sport than other leisure activities. Also, we've seen a huge increase in concussion diagnosis due to increased awareness. So in Ontario alone, concussion-related emergency department and physician office visits for children quadrupled during the years of 2003 to 2013. This probably isn't more concussions happening. It's definitely probably due to much more awareness around it. And soccer is classified as a high to moderate intensity contact collision sport. And these just give you some statistics on, this was from high school athletes in the States, just sort of where girls and boys soccer ranked in comparison to other sports in their concussion incidence rates. These things are difficult too, because some sports may have more of a culture of reporting than others. It does based on whether the athletes in that sport choose to report. But as you can see, there are definitely frequent incidents happening in soccer for concussion. So how are concussions commonly happening in soccer? The research is saying that player-to-player contact is the most common cause of concussion in soccer for both genders. And often it's the unplanned head impacts that are more likely to result in an injury than a planned one. So something that's unanticipated, you were looking the other way, sort of that accidental contact piece are more likely to cause them than the ones you brace for example, going up for a header. Position most affected are goalies and defensive midfield is what we're seeing from the literature too. And whenever we do soccer presentations, this is always asked, so I'm just gonna address it here. That recent evidence suggests there's no conclusive evidence that repetitive hitters over time cause functional changes or reverse outcomes. There is more research needed, including a variety of factors, to more accurately report whether frequency of headers should be encouraged in games and practices. At this point, what we would recommend, due to the inconclusive evidence, is that particularly with children who are younger, so under the age of 13, it's important to teach kids the proper skill set on how to do this. And in addition, we probably shouldn't be drilling it over and over again in practice. But it is an important skill to learn to do it properly with proper technique to prevent concussions from happening. But particularly with the younger kids, it's not, again, just to reiterate, it's not something in practice that kids should practice over and over again. We should try and keep it to a limit as much as possible. So what is a concussion? It's an injury to the brain caused by a blow to the head or another part of the body. And this impact causes the brain to move rapidly inside the skull. This movement actually causes stretching of the brain cells, which is at a chemical level where the changes happen, which is why we can't see it on any imaging, or there's no real concrete objective way to diagnose concussion at this time. So you'll commonly hear that maybe there's a few things out there that can diagnose concussion. There's been rumors about blood tests. Maybe some people would say a CT scan or an X-ray would. But just to clear the air, that clinical diagnosis is made by a medical professional based on observed and reported signs and symptoms, as well as clinical history, and ruling out any other causes for those symptoms. And CT scans and X-rays and MRIs cannot diagnose concussion. If someone received those types of imaging at the emergency department, the reason why it's being done is to rule out a more severe brain injury. So these are the signs and symptoms of concussion, and this is one of our infographics. They're made particularly for youth. So if you like this and you think it's something that your club would benefit from, you can get them from our website, hollandbloorview.ca/concussion. So these are things that we give out to kids just to teach them about the different signs and symptoms. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these today, but just so you're aware, most people are starting to become more aware of the physical concussion symptoms, headache, sensitivity to light or noise, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, visual problems, balance problems, and numbness and tingling. They can be a little bit more easy for kids to articulate as well. So people are tending to be more aware of these ones. The cognitive concussion symptoms are a little bit difficult and harder for kids to articulate to an adult. So feeling mentally foggy, feeling slowed down, difficulty concentrating or remembering. How you might observe that is someone's answering questions more slowly than usual or getting confused with directions or tasks. There's also emotional and behavioral symptoms, which includes irritability, sadness, nervousness, or anxiousness, or feeling more emotional. These may be things you'd be able to see initially at an injury, but these usually present themselves a few days later, and are most particularly important for kids who have prolonged recovery from concussion. They play a huge factor. And then sleep, again, as a parent, you may be noticing these things. It might be something you notice a few days later after an injury, but many kids with concussion have drowsiness, sleeping more or less than usual, having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, and just ongoing mental and physical fatigue. So again, if that's something you think would be helpful, feel free to check it out on our website. It's always important to talk about red flag symptoms though, and you'll see when we walk through the concussion policy or protocol piece, it's really important to identify the difference between general concussion symptoms and what we call red flag symptoms. Red flag symptoms are actually signs of something more severe going on, and this is when your club's emergency action plan should be started. So just to clarify, if a child's having headaches that worsen, they can't recognize people or places, there's seizures or convulsions, increasing confusion or irritability, repeated vomiting, weakness, tingling, burning in the arms and legs, a loss of consciousness. In fact, 90% of concussions are going to happen without a loss of consciousness, only a few do. Persistent or increasing neck pain, which may be a sign of a spinal cord injury, looks drowsy, can't be awakened, a very unusual behavior change, slurred speech, or focal neurological signs, which are paralysis and weakness. Also, these are all signs of something more severe is potentially going on, whether it be more moderate severe brain injury, concern about spinal cord or neck injury. All of these things need to be followed in terms of calling 911, and your emergency action plan should be initiated. So this is a different process than the general concussion symptoms I discussed earlier. And when we walk through the protocol, hopefully that will be clearer for you. So in terms of when you're not a healthcare professional and in the reality of grassroots sports, it's usually volunteer coaches on the sidelines and volunteer team trainers. Or team managers, sorry. There are really three ways that you can identify a suspected concussion. The first one is self-reported signs and symptoms. So a player comes to you self-reporting any of those symptoms to you. However, we know that often doesn't happen. So sometimes you really have to rely on your observations after an observed impact of whether you're observing any of those signs in a player. Also, we always say this, but kids and teens are much more likely at times to report to a peer than they are to you as a coach, or maybe to a staff member. Maybe they might be more likely to report it than to a parent. So it's just important to create a culture on your team where if players or parents or team officials are concerned about a kid, they come to someone on the team, whether it be the coach, to report those signs or symptoms. It's important to know that symptoms may take up to 24 to 48 hours to appear as well. So just because someone doesn't initially present with any signs or symptoms after an impact does not rule out the fact that they may have a concussion. These situations can be difficult, but we do often have kids come to our clinic who didn't feel symptoms until they were at school the next day. So this is quite common and just important to be aware of. Of all of those symptoms, you only need one to treat it as a suspected concussion. And really the rule that you're going to hear throughout this presentation is that a player should never return to play if they're experiencing any symptoms, and they're to be treated as a suspected concussion. When we're talking about a culture of reporting, so how do we encourage players to self-report, whether it be to a coach or somebody else? It's really important that we create a culture that values player safety at clubs and teams. We need players to feel comfortable reporting possible signs of concussions, whether it be coaches, officials, if there's a trainer there. And we want everyone to be allies in terms of this. So it is important to create that culture. The other thing too is that when you're observing contact or collisions, concussions can occur after a blow to the head or the body. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be impacts to the head. If there's enough force that maybe went to the chest, for example, that caused that rapid movement of the brain inside the skull, could also cause a concussion. And just because an impact wasn't hard or someone didn't think it looked that hard does not mean that a suspected concussion has not occurred. And just to remind you again that you don't need to lose consciousness to have a concussion. And really, the end of the day, it really should just be when in doubt, sit them out. And hopefully after today, you'll have a clear idea on how to actually do that. So the one thing that we'll reiterate throughout when we're implementing concussion policy and protocol is that once a player is removed, the current best practice is that any player with suspected concussion must see a medical doctor or nurse practitioner as soon as possible. So that could be the ER department, it could be a walk-in clinic, it could be their family doctor. And why is it important to receive medical assessment? So one, you want to rule out a more severe injury. Two, you want to obtain proper diagnosis. And three, you want to receive a medical note for the concussion diagnosis. So this can sort of act as a catalyst to support return to school and sport accommodations. We're really trying to make sure that kids actually go seek medical assessment for these things and just don't sort of manage them on their own at home. And again, it's important to know when you need to go to the ER versus when you could go to a walk-in clinic or a family doctor the next day. And it's those presence of the red flag symptoms that we talked about. So overall, if you think one of your players has a suspected concussion, what do you do? And you guys are probably familiar with this, but it's remove them from play and don't let them return. Seek medical assessment by a medical doctor, which we discussed. There's an initial rest period of 24 to 48 hours of rest, both physical and mental. I think an important thing to take away from this, though, is that one thing we're noticing in the concussion literature and research is that after that initial period, children should be encouraged to gradually return to daily activities that don't exceed their symptom thresholds. So we unfortunately see a lot of kids who have actually spent a lot of time in isolation and in dark rooms sort of doing nothing. So that sort of old protocol also isn't great either, where you don't want to be doing absolutely nothing as well, as that can have a lot of secondary implications, particularly for children and teens. So we really focus on making sure that kids do actively get back to their lives, as long as they're not exceeding symptom threshold while they do so, or they're not putting themselves at risk for re-injury. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but I just want to show you that for 70% of children and youth, we can expect them to recover within 4 weeks, symptom-free and back to regular activities. So what do we know that promotes that? Getting that proper medical assessment. So people who actually go seek medical care for their concussions. Good education. So children, parents, teachers, schools, coaches, all sort of being aware of how to support these things. Gradual engagement in symptom-limited activities. So again, ensuring that there's a gradual progress here in encouraging light activities that kids can participate in, and also appropriate school and sport accommodations to support the recovery. However, you can do all of those things, and you may still have a delayed recovery. So 30% of youth have symptoms that for longer than 4 weeks, and it may take them as a result longer to return to the activities they want to do. So what puts you at risk for this? First thing is having a concussion history. So if you've had a concussion before, you may be susceptible to a longer recovery. Comorbidities, so children and youth who have a history of depression, ADHD, anxiety, sleep disorders, a migraine history, or a learning disability are at risk for prolonged recovery. Also, females are more likely to have a prolonged recovery than males, and ages 13 to 17 are more likely to have a prolonged recovery than younger children. The reason for that is there's a lot of development happening in teenage years in the brain as the brain changes from a child's to an adult's brain. So that's why it might be more of a vulnerable period, as well as how severe your symptoms were presenting in the first 24 to 48 hours and what types of symptoms were present may result in a prolonged recovery. Also, if you return to activities too soon, so you sort of rush back into everything, that may delay your recovery, but also if you delay return to activities for too long. So if you do nothing, basically, for a long time as well. That's why it's really important for kids to be connected with someone to help them find what that balance is to support their recovery. So when we're talking about concussion recovery, it's also important to know that kids need to return to school and social life before they return to full sport, gameplay, and competition. And why do we recommend that? We don't want to put the brain at risk for a second concussion before it's fully healed. And school and daily life is a really great benchmark for brain readiness to return to activities. So we like to make sure that kids can tolerate full days of school, be able to handle math class, science class, all the social demands that they have before we put them in full competition play. However, early introduction of symptom-limited safe physical activity is appropriate. So as I said earlier, a common theme you're going to see is that actually light exercise is early in recovery. It's actually really helpful as long as that light exercise isn't a full gameplay, which may put them at risk for re-injury. These types of activities can really help facilitate recovery along. But these exercise programs are best when supervised by qualified personnel to do so. So this is what a return to play protocol looks like. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because we're going to walk through what the Canada Soccer one looks like in a bit. But just to give you a general snapshot here, you can see that it's just a gradual increase in complexity of physical activities and medical clearance always being required before kids participate in activities that we deem riskier, so a full contact practice. And sort of that age-old question, so can all concussions be prevented? And the answer to this is no, even when wearing the proper equipment, but there are some strategies that can help in preventing concussions. So from a soccer perspective, rule changes, so enforcing organizational rules and penalties for dangerous plays, such as elbowing while heading the ball. Also the correct age for heading, proper size and inflation of the ball can help concussion prevention. Proper technique, so heading the ball, being aware of your surroundings. Younger kids and females may have weaker neck muscles, and this could increase their chance of concussion while heading. So it is important to teach proper technique for coaches to particularly younger children when contracting head muscles and contacting the ball at the hairline of the forehead. Also, there's a lot of conversation around equipment, and just to be clear, there is no equipment that currently exists that can prevent you from getting a concussion. So headgear, helmets, mouth guards, they do not fully protect athletes from getting concussions. However, they may be obviously very important for preventing other things like other injuries like a skull fracture, a more severe brain injury, or obviously anything regarding your teeth or jaw. There is not enough evidence to state that they prevent concussions. And also I put this in here as there's a lot of questions around baseline testing at this point. And just to be clear, current consensus states that for children and youth under the age of 18, it's not recommended at this point and is not necessary to provide post-injury care. And what's probably more important at this point is to ensure that when kids get injuries, they go seek proper medical assessment than it would be to do any pre-injury testing. So that's sort of a brief rundown of the education pieces. If you have any questions, I do encourage you to type them into the chat, or I'm not sure if you can be connected to audio. At this point, I'm just going to leave 2 minutes for general questions about concussion education. But right after this, we're going to sort of dive into, okay, so what do I do with this information and how do I actually implement this at a club level or a team level to make sure it's happening. So before we dive into that, are there any questions at this point?
Thanks, Steph. So far, a couple have come in, but they're more so about their backgrounds and what they were. So I can pass some of those on to you really quickly and let you know as that gives some time for people to answer.
Sure.
Just scroll up in here. Let me see if I can find some of these. Apparently some people's chat boxes weren't working, so they tried to put it in there. Let's see if I can find one.
Okay.
So the first question is about not recommending baseline concussion testing for kids under 18.
Yep.
So, and just in generically, so you don't recommend that happens at all?
Yeah, at this point, we wouldn't recommend it happens at all. And the reason why is kids present so differently day to day. So it's quite difficult to get a consistent, reliable pre-injury snapshot of that. There has been baseline testing programs that have had measures that have shown some controversial validity in whether they're working for children or if they're reliable at this point. So the reason why it's not being recommended is because it really isn't the most important aspect of supporting kids with concussion care. What is just getting the care when kids have concussions. And we don't need pre-injury measures to support kids' safe return to activity.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. A couple, while some more people type out, we have just a little bit background of where some people are from. We have people who are just within clubs in an administrative role who are trying to understand the background behind concussions and looking into the new procedures and policies. We have a couple coaches, and we have some physio and occupational therapists within school board districts that support the return to school protocols. So a little bit of a general background all over the place, so that's pretty interesting there.
Great.
And I think so far that might be it. Do you have anything that you've come across relating to this topic that seem to be questions that come up often on your end that you've kind of had as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'll probably just bring those up as we go through the next pieces.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot more here, and this is where we're going to start to get into the more concrete, how do we actually do this perspective. So I'll try and answer some of those frequently asked questions as I go along.
No problem. So
Great.
We'll give maybe another 30 seconds, see if anybody has any questions to come up, and then we can move on to that one.
Sounds good.
Perfect. Actually, if it's okay, I'd like to ask you a question as in my role. So, as I mentioned, I'm one of the regional managers of player development at Ontario Soccer, and I'm also a learning facilitator as well. So I do the community stream coaching courses, and we have a component on emergency action plan and dealing with concussions. And a lot of the questions that come up during that section are coaches seem to they want to know in a way how to differentiate when there's an actual concussion symptom that's being self-reported, or they might see, versus a kid just saying something and almost crying concussion. And I know that we all go the route of when in doubt, sit them out just to be safe so everybody's secure. But it seems to be something that's come up, and I know you talked about there's the self-reporting, the peer reporting, and what you observe as a coach, but do you have anything you can take on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to touch on that like very shortly in terms of recognizing, because it's really difficult, particularly with kids, make these decisions. So, and at the end of the day, the theme will be coaches know the kids best. You're also going to have to just use your best judgment, but also know that if you really don't know and you're really unsure, that decision's probably left with someone else and not the coach. Yeah, so we'll talk about that, but it is a very common theme I hear across the sessions. So
perfect, no problem. All right, so I think that's about it. So then we'll progress to the next section.
Great. So part 2 of this is going to be, so does your club, if you have a concussion policy or protocol, are you looking to create one? And if so, how do you implement it at the club level? So just to sort of walk through the how to do this. So the objective of concussion policy and protocols are obviously to ensure players are playing in the safest environment as possible. And really the twofold goal here is to remove players who suspect concussion from activities and ensure they return to sport safely. So common barriers we see with successful implementation. First and foremost is a lack of understanding of roles and responsibilities of stakeholders. So quite often there seems like there's this general concussion protocol, but no one really knows whose job is where. So what does the coach have to do? What do parents have to do? What officials have to do? So hopefully that will be a bit clear of what the ideal roles should be. Also, there's a policy that sort of lives on a PDF, but people lack tools and coordinated processes to support the stakeholders in the implementation. So how do I actually give people the things that we need, or what can we actually have to make sure this is a coordinated process that's well understood by everybody? Also, misconceptions. So a lot of people sort of know basically kind of what they're supposed to do, but they don't really know how they're going to do it. And a lot of the why is confusing too, the rationale of certain things in concussion protocols. So hopefully those things become a little bit clearer today. I'm not sure how many of you before logging on today were aware of Rowan's Law, but the reason why concussion protocols are getting a lot of attention currently is that there was provincial legislation passed in 2018 in March, which basically states that concussion education and remove and return to sport protocols are now law, which is why Canada Soccer has created a policy, which the plan is to disseminate that from provincial to local organizations. And basically the reason why this bill was created was a very unfortunate situation that happened with a teenage female rugby player, Rowan, who passed away from a very rare incidence of second impact syndrome, where she had 3 concussions in a week span. I want to state that it is very rare that this were to happen, but I think at the end of the day, what everyone could agree on is that Rowan's tragic death was preventable. And the reason why this legislation exists is to ensure that this does not happen again. So the main things that are currently stated in Rowan's Law, Bill 193, is number 1 is that all stakeholders should be reviewing concussion awareness resources prior to the start of a sports season. So currently we're working with Ontario Soccer to sort of support a lot of this stuff, but that is piece number 1. Number 2 is that organizations have to establish a concussion code of conduct, which basically just states which types of behaviors should and shouldn't happen within their sport. And what we're going to talk a lot about today is how to ensure remove from sport protocols and return to sport protocols are created by organizations. These have been created. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is they're created, but how do we make sure people actually follow them? So hopefully that's clear. So what we're going to talk about is there's basically 7 steps to this. The first one being recognition, the second one being remove from sport, the third one being reporting it, the fourth one being initial medical assessment, 5th, medical diagnosis, then there's concussion management and return to sport and medical clearance. And there are 7 steps, but everyone kind of has a different level of involvement in these steps, some more heavy than others. And you'll see these yellow stars I'm going to put up as we go through, which are going to identify a tool that you can use to support implementation of these things at your club as we walk through them. So who's involved in implementation? The primary main people that are involved are head coaches, players, and parents. Reason being is coaches are there most often. They are the ones who supervise training. They are the adults that is most consistently present when suspected concussions may happen. And obviously, the concussions are happening to the players, and then the parents are supporting the medical piece of this. But we also want to talk a lot about this role you're hearing me call as the designate. And something that we've found has been very successful in implementing concussion policy and protocols is identifying a third party to support the coaches, parents, and players in these processes. And it can kind of be up to you on who would work best for your club or team. Some districts and clubs have decided that club administrators are their designates, and they play a really key role in supporting coaches and parents through this process. Some have identified team managers, some have identified executive members. So just when you hear me go throughout the presentation, I'm going to refer to it as a designate. It can be a multiple of people, but basically what we're saying is it's really important for a third party to be introduced to this. Otherwise, from our experience, we find coaches, players, and parents just kind of handle this amongst the team on their own. And there's a lot of unclarity, and it can be a lot for a coach to take on, particularly in a volunteer role. So adding someone else to help the coach and the parents and the players through the process, from our experience, has been incredibly helpful. If you're not aware, Canada Soccer has put out its new concussion policy. The link is down below. We'll provide it afterwards as well. If you just want to look it up on Google, it's a quick Google search. And a lot of what we're talking about today is completely aligned with this. We're also going to give you just some additional things that may help you further to implement this. So we're going to start by talking about a case scenario. So this is sort of a potential scenario that would happen, and what would you do sort of from start to finish. So let's say Ryan, a player, ran into another player during a game and fell down onto the field. He continued playing, but you observe Ryan to be slower than usual after collision and reacting slower to plays. The head coach subs Ryan off at the next opportunity and asks him if he's okay. Ryan says he's fine, but he has some blurry vision and a slight headache. The head coach decides to remove the player from the game for a suspected concussion, and at this point he would enter the concussion policy. So as you can see from what we talked about, there are 2 self-reported symptoms, blurry vision and a slight headache. The coach also made observations that seemed a little bit outside himself, and this is enough to suspect that a player has had a concussion. Also, there's been an impact that you witnessed of him running into another player. So at this point, when we're talking about when like an Ontario Soccer or a Canada Soccer policy needs to be followed, it's basically in any team or club sanctioned activities. So league or cup matches, Ontario Soccer sanctioned competition, or any team coach supervised training. So any type of practice as well. At the end of the day, everyone in the game, including sideline staff, coaches, officials, the parents and the players, should be aware of the signs and symptoms of concussion. And any player who experiences them should be removed immediately. And like we said, signs and symptoms can be self-reported, visual, or peer-reported. When it comes to recognition, though, we have basically decided, what we have found the most successful is that when it comes to recognition, everyone's responsible for recognizing. But a theme that you'll see is, okay, but who's actually responsible for the removal from play piece? And the most consistent person for that is to be the coach. So right now we're just talking about recognition, and that's really everyone's role. But once you recognize, who do you report to? And you report to the coach to ensure that that player is removed. So we talked about this already, just to put them up again, but recognition is in two categories. Are you recognizing general concussion symptoms or red flags? General concussion symptoms fall within this category. And then the red flag symptoms are the ones that you follow your emergency action plan. It's really important people know that these are a 911 emergency situation. Here's a tool for you. So many of you may have seen this, but this is a concussion recognition tool. It's just basically something we encourage everyone to have on the sidelines to remind them what the signs and symptoms are, as well as the red flag symptoms and how they should be treated differently. And everyone can use this tool to help recognize concussions, but we particularly recommend that coaches have them on them for practices and games. But when we're talking about removal, so once there's a potential suspect concussion that's been identified, how do you ensure the immediate and safe removal? So who is responsible? If a suspected concussion occurs within soccer, it is the responsibility of the coach to remove players with suspected concussion from participation in soccer activity immediately. From our experience, it's also really helpful to notify coaches that this is their role. And quite often, if it's not clear, what happens is everyone kind of turns to each other, and if no one's deciding to remove the kid, they all just feel like it's fine. So if someone knows it's their job to do so, to the best of their ability, understanding they are a volunteer, then it's much more likely to happen. But it is important to know that everyone holds a responsibility in recognizing it, but they just need to know who they report to. So what should coaches do? First things first is to ensure the player is monitored until the parent or guardian is contacted on site. The coach obviously doesn't need to monitor themselves as they may be coaching at that time, but just to make sure that they are being monitored by someone until their parent or guardian has been contacted. Players with a suspected concussion should not be left alone, and also older players shouldn't drive themselves. So that's sort of the basic first pieces of a removed from play protocol. Also, we're about to talk about this in more detail, but not sure how many of you have injury report forms or how well implemented they are, but we are highly encouraging that injury report forms are filled out after concussion is suspected, and there's a number of reasons why we think that's important we'll talk about in a bit. And then after a report form is filled out, basically the coach says, I recommend that you go see a medical doctor or nurse practitioner immediately. And at that point, it is on the parents to make sure that that appointment happens. And coaches are to know that kids shouldn't return to any practice or team until they've received clarification about that appointment and whether a concussion diagnosis has been received or not. So basically, what is the importance of filling out an injury report form, and why would we do this? First things first is, from our experience, we find when report forms are implemented and people understand that they exist, this actually ensures that it's a catalyst. It starts the concussion policy process. It formalizes it. It also is a record of the suspected injury. This is really important, actually, even for us as medical professionals, because quite often we see kids who come to us who may not even remember the incident themselves, and their parent wasn't there. So we actually rely on coaches' reportings through injury reports to sort of tell us what happened, to help us make better diagnosis and treatment decisions. Also, to communicate. So if you fill out an injury report form, it's a consistent way of communicating suspected injuries to both parents. Then we'll talk about the designate role as well you're going to communicate it to, and the medical community. And surveillance. So if you as a club or a district are interested in finding more about how these are happening, it is a good way of tracking data. So we recommend that a form is completed by the head coach in the event of any suspected concussion in any club or team soccer activity. What we also recommend, though, is that outside of this form just being provided to the parent or guardian, this is when you also are providing a form to a designate. So if that's the club admin, the team manager, an executive member, just basically inviting a third party in the situation to say, hey, someone's been suspected of having a concussion. This player shouldn't be back until they've received medical diagnosis. So that's why we recommend that that's done. Also, we really recommend that parents take this form to their medical appointments. So this is what the form looks like that we have created for a few organizations, and you can feel free to take. It's actually on the Ontario Soccer website, and it's under coaches, under resources for concussion, called the Suspect Concussion Report Form. It's pretty basic. Just includes the demographic information up here, the signs and symptoms that were reported at the time, other things that you'd like to record. Sorry, coughing. In addition to a signature at the bottom for the coach, to basically just say that they recommended to the parent or guardian that they see a medical doctor. And we just find these really helpful. So if you're looking for one of these report forms, a template has been made, and you can go online and basically ensure that people have it to initiate these processes. So before we dive into the next piece, just an opportunity for questions. So we talked about recognizing concussions, removing them from sport and who's responsible, as well as reporting them, and sort of giving you two tools here. So the recognition tool, in addition to a report form, to ensure that these happen at your club. So at this point, are there any questions regarding these three pieces? We're about to talk about medical assessment, return to sport. I just want to check in whether people are following or they have any questions about these three steps.
Nothing been posted so far. I think this has been pretty broken down in a way for our audience members to understand it. But if anything comes in, we can give them about 30 seconds or so. If that works. Steph, yeah?
Yeah, that works great. I'll just give 1 minute.
Perfect.
For you to send stuff in.
I'll just look through. We do have one. One that just did come in is, has there been any cases of liability issues with their, we expanded a little bit longer than that 30 seconds. We have another one that just came in. So
yep.
This one is a little bit longer, so I will try to say it, and if I do miss a step, I'll repeat it. So it's saying, how should club concussion policies define when reporting is necessary by coaches and managers for the situations which don't clearly identify a concussion? For example, if a player is removed from a game because they claim of a headache after lightly banging their head, is parent oversight sufficient over the next 24 hours, or is a doctor's note required for them to return to play?
Yeah, great question. We're about to talk about that, and the short answer now is that they need to go see a doctor to clarify that. A parent's report isn't sufficient.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about how do you make sure you're getting consistent answers back from the medical community on whether someone had a concussion or not. And we've been working with this very closely with hockey and local hockey in Toronto League. Tools that can be really helpful for clarifying that. And also, I think it's really important when kids are removed that they're understood and parents understand that that's the policy. They can't just come back and tell you how they feel. There has to be written documentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. That seems to be all that's come in.
Great.
Any more get asked throughout this, then I'll add them into the next question period.
Great. Those are really good questions, and hopefully a little bit of more clarity as we go through about, okay, so I removed someone, I filled out a report form, now what do I do kind of piece. So it's important to know that it is the parent or guardian's responsibility to take the player to see medical doctor or nurse practitioner immediately. You see that we keep saying medical doctor or nurse practitioner. It's just really important to know that at this point, those are who are recommended to make diagnostic decisions around concussion. When we're doing these policy and protocols, people go to a lot of different types of people who may have doctor in front of their name. That does not necessarily mean they're a medical doctor or a nurse practitioner, which have been identified in best practice guidelines to make decisions around ruling out other types of illnesses or injuries that may present as concussion, and also be able to deal with things that are potentially more serious in nature. So that's why those professions have been recommended. Obviously, at this point, anyone who's been removed, no player with a suspected concussion return to any type of club or team activity until they've been medically assessed. And just another tool for you here, sometimes it can be really difficult to explain to families consistently where they need to go to get their medical diagnosis. And another tool that we're going to talk to you about is just called the removal summary. It's basically just an algorithm that coaches can give to families to say, look, follow through with this and sort of let me know when you're back and you've been able to determine if you have a concussion or not, and sort of keep me posted on the process. So the reason why having these summaries is helpful is it ensures consistent messaging on next steps from the sidelines. We're not sort of relying on coaches to walk parents through a complicated healthcare system. It's just a one-page summary that any coach could give to a parent. Also to ensure that people are actually going to get the right care for diagnosis. And also, in all honesty, sometimes these situations are incredibly stressful for parents and families, for families and kids, sorry. Particularly if it's a quite obvious injury, it's very stressful. And any tool at this point that can help people navigate the system accurately is really helpful. So just so you know, this is also on the Ontario Soccer website, and you can check it out. And it would just be something that you would kind of attach to that report form that I showed you earlier to help consistent messaging on how to seek medical assessment. But then let's talk about the diagnosis. So basically, we're saying in every situation, written documentation needs to come back about whether they've had a concussion or not. So here's the process if it comes back and the player has determined they do not have a concussion. The parents or guardians need to give that written documentation to both the head coach and whoever your identified designate is. So just keep sure to invite that third party in to support the coach. Coaches aren't to let anyone return to any activity until they've received that documentation. Designate what their primary role is to review it and only follow up with the head coach if necessary. So if there's something on there that really doesn't make sense, just a second eye to sort of help the coach. It's also just important to know if someone went to the ER department, let's say that night, and came back the next morning, and they were determined they didn't have a concussion, that these people should be told to monitor their symptoms for 24 to 48 hours, thinking about how they can be delayed, like I told you earlier in the presentation. But at this point, it's just important to know that people should be monitored for 24 to 48 hours after an event to see if signs and symptoms take longer to show up or worsen. At the end of the day, it's kind of on the parent or guardians to ensure this from what was recommended at the medical appointment, but it's just an important clarification for everyone to be aware of. If it's determined that the player does have a concussion, it's a little more straightforward here, as at this point, the parent or guardian is making you, the head coach, aware, or the designate, both of them together. And at this point, they're not expected to be back to practice or games for a few days or weeks, depending on their recovery. And the players to begin the return to sport protocol. So basically, at this point, there is no return, and they're starting to go to the return to sport protocol, and we'll talk about what that looks like. But just to clarify, so no concussion, medical documentation should be sent to a coach and a designate. Yes, concussion, exactly the same thing. If there was no concussion at the appointment, just keep in mind that 24 to 48 hour monitoring rule. If it hasn't been past that, it's just an important thing to be aware of. And that anyone who does have a concussion has to follow return to sport protocol. If you didn't have a concussion, you don't need to follow that return to sport protocol. So Canada Soccer has actually created and drafted a concussion medical assessment letter. So this is just something you could have on your website, or maybe it's something the designate is aware of, to kind of help people basically have an assessment letter that can be a bit more clear about whether kids have had concussions or not. Sometimes the medical notes that people get back are very unclear, and it's really hard for coaches and the identified designate to make sense of what it's been saying. We started using this medical assessment through hockey this year, and actually a lot of physicians used it, and it was much clearer. So if you think this would be helpful, again, maybe not so something involved from a coach level, but the designate would take on, just gotta help parents to say, hey, when you go to this appointment, this letter could be really helpful in helping us determine whether your kid had a concussion or not, just to make it clear. This is also available on the Ontario Soccer website as well. So just another tool for you. When we're talking about management, just to know, we talked about this, but really important to reiterate is that most kids are going to recover within 4 weeks. And we talked about all the things that help facilitate that recovery. But just keeping in mind that of those 15 to 30% who may have symptoms for longer, at this point, we highly recommend that people seek support outside of a medical doctor or nurse practitioner, maybe as their primary care provider, but a more multidisciplinary team who may include a variety of other professionals that can help with the rehabilitation. So just an important thing to be aware of, that if someone's struggling for a while, they really should be seeking more multidisciplinary supports is the current recommendation. Just something to be aware of, Holland Bloorview has a handbook that can kind of help people who do have concussions with those first few days of management strategies, like what do I do? What are things that I should or shouldn't be doing? And it's a helpful tool for parents. So that's also on the Ontario Soccer website. You can check it out in the concussion resources section. And though this is not something the sport world can ensure, it's just a reminder again that kids should be returning to school and doing their school workload before returning to full sport participation. But many kids may be doing modified practices or just doing exercise while still trying to return to school, and that's completely appropriate. Before we dive into the last piece of today, which is how do we return to sport piece, and sort of the conclusions of everything, does anyone have any questions about the initial medical assessment and medical diagnosis steps? So we sort of described how do you make sure people go seek proper initial medical assessment by giving them that algorithm to sort of walk them through it from sidelines to appointment, and also that there are some templates that can help diagnosis be a bit clearer when it comes back to you. I know it seems like maybe a lot of paperwork up front, but in reality, it actually makes a lot of these processes quite easier once they're better understood. So does anyone have any questions at this point before we dive into the final steps of today?
We'll give everybody another minute or so, Steph, just so they can start typing them in. If they haven't yet come up. As they come in, I will pass them on to you.
Sure.
Perfect. Here's the first one. When coaches remove a player due to precautionary measures, do parents have the right to take 24 to 48 hours before seeing a doctor in cases where the player didn't clearly suffer a concussion?
So it's kind of on the parents to decide how soon they want to seek medical assessment. The recommendation is to do it within the first 24 to 48 hours if it's general concussion symptoms and not the red flag symptoms. Just for coaches to know, they just can't expect that child back at any club or team activity until they've seen someone. However long the parents choose to do that is kind of their choice. Maybe I would just reiterate that it's recommended it's done in 1 to 2 days. But really we shouldn't be removing someone who doesn't report signs and symptoms. So I just want to make that clear, like if there was an impact but no signs or symptoms at all, then there's no reason to suspect a concussion. The two have to go together. So there has to be symptoms that you observed, someone told you, or they told you themselves, in addition to the impact. We don't want to get in the realm where we just remove every kid who's had an impact who didn't have signs or symptoms. So I just want to hope that that's clear. It's just important that if someone did have an impact and they didn't have initial signs and symptoms, technically they're still okay to play, but maybe when you're sort of just let the parents know there was an impact and monitor it over the next 2 days and let you know. So hopefully that provides some clarification there. We wouldn't remove unless there's signs and symptoms in the moment.
Okay, and then to build on that previous question, there was also a sub question there. What if the parents refuse to see a doctor? What should the coaches do?
Yeah.
I think we follow the same, but yeah. And in your environment with other sports, have you noticed things similar to that?
Oh yeah, that happens. And to be honest, coaches kind of like having that person to escalate it to, so it's not really their issue anymore. And actually, we've received a lot less pushback from families than we expected. So when we've implemented this stuff, people have gone along with the policy and protocol well. At the end of the day, they want their kids to be part of sport, right? So they go along with it, and they're also appreciative of other people looking out for their kids' safety. There will always be a few who don't, but it's been a lot less than we ever expected, to be honest. So that's a positive change.
Perfect. Yeah, and I agree. There are the majority who obviously, of course, they're looking out for the best interest, and they understand that. And there are some exceptions where there's external pressures, or for whatever reason that they don't want, for example, their child to miss out on this quote unquote opportunity because of a suspected concussion. So I think what you've highlighted about the importance of making this as open and as an open procedure between all three and that designate really gets everybody on the same path and the same page, where it's, yeah, you might be missing this one opportunity now, but the long-term gain far outweighs the short-term.
Yeah, exactly. And making parents aware that this is something that would happen on their team at the beginning of the season is so helpful. So it's not this giant surprise halfway through. So anything you can do to communicate to people to set expectations early can really prevent some of those frustrating hiccups or things like that along the way. So people know the expectation.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Any other questions, or we could
none that have come in yet, so I think we can move
okay.
on to the next part, and I'll add anything that comes after.
Good. And just so everyone knows, if anyone's cognizant of time, anticipate this to take just about 10 to 15 more minutes at this point, just so you can plan your days. So the last piece here is the return to sport piece. So just knowing that anyone who's diagnosed with a concussion should follow return to sport protocol. And typically, parents and players are going to be the most responsible people for ensuring this. However, I think it's really important that coaches are aware, as kids will be coming back to do modified practices prior to medical clearance. So we'll talk about what a modified practice looks like. But Canada Soccer has outlined that in their return to play protocol, but it is just important for coaches to know, like, what should I be doing with a kid who's coming back for their first few games, or first few practices, sorry, after a concussion? How should I modify it? So hopefully this provides some clarification. First things first, it's important to know that depending on the severity and types of symptoms, everyone's going to take a different amount of time to work through return to play protocol. Each stage should take a minimum of 24 hours, but honestly, these take a little bit longer in kids. If basically the statement is that if a player experiences new symptoms or worsening symptoms when going through the stages, they just go back to the previous successful stage. They don't have to go all the way back to zero. I think a lot of people do that, and it's just unnecessary restrictive rest if they do that. So just know, if a kid gets a bit of symptoms at practice, the best practice is, okay, let's just go back to what was working before your previous successful stage before we try that stage again. So these are the stages. These are from the Canada Soccer policy. Stages 0 to 2 are pretty basic and honestly not as relevant to the sport group. These kind of, the sport membership, this kind of relies on parents and kids to do on their own. So stage 1 we talked about is that initial rest period. So 1 to 2 days of minimal activity. Stage 1 is when they start to do activities that don't provoke their symptoms. And then stage 2 is light exercise and light cognitive activities. So doing a few things at home, nothing that's sport specific, and sort of shows you here how long they should be doing those for and what the main objective is of those stages. So primarily these are done at home or the community. It's not until stage 3 that a player would come to a modified sport practice, where maybe they would just be doing some soccer specific skill work on their own. It's important to know that no kid who hasn't been medically cleared should be doing any scrimmaging, heading of the ball, or activities that put them at risk for accidental contact. So what we typically recommend, particularly for children, is that they sort of start their practices working one-on-one. Maybe it's with a trusted teammate, or maybe with an assistant coach or another adult. You're basically just trying to create the most controlled environment that you can, particularly in maybe those younger kids where the environment can be really unpredictable. So just making it super controlled. And for there, you're just progressing the complexity of the training activities that they're doing, but still at this point, absolutely no scrimmaging, heading the ball, or any activities that will put them at high risk for accidental contact. So just so you know, no one should be doing any contact activities at practice until they've been cleared by a medical doctor and nurse practitioner, the same 2 people we identified for diagnosis. Once they've been cleared, they're good to start full contact practices and then go on to gameplay. So just a few points about that. Once medical clearance for stage 5 has been obtained, how this actually logistically should happen is that the parents or guardians, just like they did for diagnosis, should take that written documentation highlighting that the player is safe to return to a full team practice, and the return to play form showing that they've been completing it, and give it to the head coach and the identified designate. Basically, head coaches are to ensure that no one does any contact practices, contact activities at practice until they've been medically cleared to do so. And designates are just there to support, be that third party again, and only follow up with parents or players if there's something there that doesn't make sense. Unique considerations for kids and teens, though, is that Again, kids should be able to return to school before they're doing full contact practice. Also, I said this, but I'll just reiterate again, youth really benefit from a more gradual return to practice to ensure a controlled environment, as there can be a lot more accidental contact scenarios with children in practices, maybe more than adults, just due to the nature of working with kids. The other thing too is that, concussion aside, some of these kids may have been out for a few weeks or maybe a month or two. So you also want to make sure kids have regained their pre-injury skill level and confidence before going back to gameplay, especially if that concussion happened within the context they're returning to. Some kids might have a lot of anxiety about returning, so you want to make sure a kid feels really confident as has their skill set back before they do so. And no one knows that better than the coach. And just so you know, a lot of youth organizations, to sort of support a return to sport protocol, have adopted return to sport protocols that have sign-off stages for the parents and players to track their progress. Wouldn't be anything that like coaches or staff would have to do. It would all be on the parents or players. But I'll just show you here. It's very small, but you can go check it out on the website. Basically, it's just breaking down the exact stages that are outlined in Canada Soccer and just encouraging parents and players to sign which stages they've successfully been able to do, just to track progress along, and also a bit of an education point for parents and players as well. This is currently being done in Toronto Soccer Association, also in Greater Toronto Hockey League here in Toronto. So some people find these really helpful. It's not something you have to do, just a tool for you if you choose to use it. So just to finish off the presentation here, thinking of that case scenario we presented earlier, I think the reality is this case scenario is maybe one of the more obvious ones. And just want to appreciate that there are two potential other case scenarios that it might happen not quite like that, and they're actually quite common. So we touched on this a little bit, but what if a suspected concussion from a club or team activity is not identified or reported until days or weeks after? So they didn't identify any signs or symptoms initially, seemed fine, continued playing. Then a day or two later or a week later, a parent or player comes to you and says, hey, I really haven't been feeling good since that game on Saturday. At this point, you now have a suspected concussion because now there's signs and symptoms. Though they were not immediately there, they are now there. So this, you can fill out injury report forms. We encourage organizations to do this after the fact. So you try and fill it out the best that you can if you remember what happened or the context. And at this point, now that there's signs and symptoms, they are to go see a medical doctor and nurse practitioner immediately and not return. But just so you know, there can be a delay here. It's important to follow up with people to ensure they haven't had any signs or symptoms later on. Scenario two, this also happens a lot. Kids just don't play soccer. They obviously do a lot of other things and could have concussions in other contexts. So what if a player is diagnosed with a concussion from a non-club or team activity? So it was at school, other sports, a soccer-related thing that didn't have anything to do with your club or team. What do you do here? So just so you know, we're typically recommending to groups that they don't have to fill out that report form for concussions that happened outside of the context of their club or team. What we're just asking for at this point is medical diagnosis, because the report forms are to track instances that are happening within soccer for your club or team. At this point, you're just asking for the diagnosis to make sure that they've gone and seen someone for a concussion they got for something else, and they are still to follow our return to play protocol to soccer, even though their concussion didn't happen in soccer. So just so you know, we want to return kids safely regardless of where they got their concussions, and that's the second consideration there. Just to final off, like, what are all the roles and responsibilities that we'd recommend? So just to summarize here, when we're talking about policy and protocol, what we recommend head coaches should be responsible for is recognizing, even though everyone's responsible, they are also primarily responsible. And the main thing is removing, monitoring, and recommending they seek medical attention. Also to complete injury report forms the best that they can. They may have not seen it directly witnessed, but they can lean on someone who did. Also that they're to receive all the forms from the parents, but also this is in collaboration with the designate to help them with that. And just make sure that no player is returning to a game or a full contact practice until they've been medically cleared to do so. So that's the head coach role. That's the designate role. They're also receiving all of the report forms to support the coach and sort of initiate that process, follow up with parents and families if necessary, receiving the medical documentation. It can also be an important role for providing clarity to families who have questions, so now a lot of that doesn't have to go on to the coach. And also, again, just supporting the process and communication updates is the role of designate and whoever you think that would make the most sense to you. primary responsibilities for parents and players is to go and get the medical documentation, ensure return to sport protocols are followed, and communicating and sending the documentation to designates and coaches. And obviously for players, it's to report signs and symptoms and be honest with how they feel, and also gradually remove through return to sport protocols. We didn't talk about these as much, but at the end of the day, all team officials are responsible for the recognition piece, and match officials do play a role as well. And also the recognizing, reporting suspected concussions to a head coach that maybe the coach didn't see. Sometimes officials have more of an eye on the game than the coach, and also enforce rules and penalties for dangerous plays as well. So just to finalize all the documents I talked about here, just so you know, again, there's the Canada Soccer Policy that we encourage you guys to look for your club. Then these are the tools that we thought would be helpful for coaches for implementation. So how do you recognize it, report it, refer it? So those are the three things that would be helpful if coaches had on the sidelines. So these are all available on the website. Go print them off and or make your coaches aware that these are tools for them. And then once you're in recovery, what could be helpful for designates, players, and parents? The medical assessment form to give some clarity around diagnosis. And if you're interested, a more specific return to play protocol that has the sign-offs for parents. So those are the other tools we talked about today. Not sure if you're local, but Holland Bloorview does have services for kids with concussion. Unfortunately, these are only available to people within the GTA. So just wanted to put these two up here to say we do have a clinic for kids that are less than 4 weeks and kids who are persistent greater than 4 weeks. Go check them out on our website if those are of interest to you. If you're not local, here are two things that could be helpful to you. The handbook, it's also on the Ontario website, just a guideline for parents and kids to walk them through recovery. We also have webinar sessions called Concussion and You, where anyone can sign up at any time to get some information on best management strategies. The webinars are live, and they can sign up whenever they'd like. If you're a non-local person, that could be helpful to you. So sorry, that was a lot of information, but does anyone have any final questions at this point? Basically, we walk through the return to play protocol. What are the different scenarios that you might want to consider if someone had delay symptoms or got concussion in another sport, as well as the stakeholder responsibilities and all the resources for you. Any final questions for today?
Thank you, Stephanie. We did get a few come in. The first one is about the training provided to physicians regarding return to play recommendations and protocols in terms of an alignment between non-Holland Bloorview physicians, I believe, is the question.
Good question. So we're working hard to support education initiatives for primary care physicians out in the community. One of our scientists is currently doing a best practice guideline where a large part of it is making physicians more aware of best practice. There's a lot of online tools and webinars. There's something called the CAT Medical Professional Tool, CATT, Medical Professional Training for Concussion, that also exists to support this. Holland Bloorview is also going to start hosting conferences for primary care providers too. We understand this is a big gap in the system, but what we do encourage, what we have found is organizations that have really good policy or protocols actually tend to educate the medical community. So I know that seems a little odd, but on the proper processes, some physicians are great, and a lot of them are doing really well to stay in line with best practice, but some are obviously still slow to catch up, and that's the reality. There's a lot of efforts going on. I just encourage people to keep an eye on whether the recommendations they're getting seem in line with what they've been hearing are best practices.
Perfect, thank you. Another one came in, as we did have a few people come in, I think after the very beginning of it. So you may have missed the beginning of the webinar, just to highlight that players with prior concussions are in fact at higher risk for repeat concussions, correct?
Yes, so from what we're seeing, yes, a little bit of a twofold answer to that. People who have had concussions recently, we're showing in the research, are more susceptible to another concussion, which is why we follow return to play protocol limiting contact activities, because we're trying to prevent re-injury where two concussions happen too close together in a time period. So that's the main reason why we follow return to play protocols, in addition to monitoring symptoms, but really trying to make sure kids don't get two concussions too close together. So you're more susceptible, particularly right after a concussion. However, there is also research to show that people who have had multiple concussions over their lifetime may be more susceptible to having concussions. There's also research to show that there might be genetic factors at play as well of why people are more susceptible. So, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And a final one that came in is, you spoke to the multidisciplinary medical treatment as best practice for concussion rehab. What does that look like through Holland Bloorview's concussion clinic?
Great, I'll just go back to that slide. So it's twofold. For kids who are within the early care model within the first 4 weeks, so we actually do see kids within the first 4 weeks in a multidisciplinary realm. We see anyone, but honestly, we tend to see a lot of those high-risk kids. So kids who this is not their first concussion, they have a lot of high-risk factors coming in. So multidisciplinary will include a physician, so a medical doctor, in addition to occupational therapy and physiotherapy. Basically, it requires a physician referral. So you still have to get that diagnosis to confirm concussion in order to access the program. And it really just walks kids through symptom management, return to school supports, return to sport guidance, and medical clearance, that whole piece. For kids who are having longer persisting symptoms, the multidisciplinary model broadens. So in addition to physician and OT and PT, there's nursing, social work, and neuropsychology. Also requires a physician referral, and at this point is a more individualized based approach to their goals, highly individualized depending on what the issues the child is presenting with. So those are the two multidisciplinary models that we work with. Hopefully that answers your question. A lot of models may look somewhat like this and a lot might not. Current best practice just states that there should be a physician or a medical doctor attached to the care, is what we're most trying to ensure in kids and teens.
Thank you for that. And a follow-up and elaboration kind of along that is, has Holland Bloorview looked at, are there any known trials in place looking at the effectiveness of the Bauer neck compression device marketed as a tool to prevent injury?
Yeah, the neck collar. Sorry,
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, okay. So no, we had them come and do a presentation for us a year back, I want to say. We wouldn't recommend it to anyone at this point, as we don't think there's been enough evidence at this point to show that it prevents concussions. None of the research done on it wasn't done on kids. So just because something is FDA approved doesn't mean it's evidence-based. So we wouldn't recommend it at this point, and there is no evidence to show that it would prevent concussions. And there's a lot of risk there, particularly with children. So yeah, no, we aren't recommending it at this point. There's a lot more research that needs to be done before it's something we'd consider.
Perfect, thank you for that. Did have one just come in right now. Give me 1 second to pull it up again. Okay, so this is more of a comment of a scenario that happened. Perfect, thank you. We do have one last question that came in. And if it becomes one that might be difficult to answer here, we can always look to take it offline, but it's more of a question as to what the occupational therapist and physiotherapy rehab at Holland Bloorview might include.
Like what the roles are?
I believe so.
Okay, so honestly, these kind of depends a little bit on the kid and the assessment and what they're presenting with. Our occupational therapist, which is myself, within the clinic, we take quite a holistic approach. A lot of them are symptom management strategies, so energy conservation in addition to energy activation, fatigue management, sleep strategies, return to school supports, recommendations, exercise support symptoms. And physio will also do a lot of those things as well, primarily more on the return to sport piece, or if there's any other presenting issues like balance or vestibular issues or visual issues, our physiotherapists tend to take on as well. But quite honestly, our roles within our scopes change depending on the individualized needs of the kid. To be honest too, I work quite a lot with mental health, in addition with concussion recovery, just due to the nature of a lot of the kids that we see. And sometimes the difficulties of being out of sport and the complexities of sport identity and stresses in school and those types of things. So that's also a common theme and role that we feel like we need to take on as well. Within the persistent clinic, obviously, some of those roles go a little bit further with social work and neuropsych. I'm just speaking to the basic ones within the initial pieces of recovery.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I don't believe any more have come in. Actually, no, one did just come in. Are those recommendations typically shared in a report with parents, and that could then be shared with the schools, either in a discharge summary or a transition to school report?
That kind of depends on what the family wants to do. So the way like private healthcare information is provided is we tend to provide it directly to the families, and it's on the families to decide if they want to share that with school or sport or other third parties. We do sometimes get written consent from families to speak directly with school or sport organizations to support these recommendations. It can be provided if you ask them, but just know they are the holders of their information and can't be done without their consent. And typically we rely on families to share that information in the reports that they get.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Stephanie, and thank you for those who took the time out of their lunch to sit in with this webinar. We did get some comments that did commend the clearness and conciseness of this package and the webinar that you delivered. So again, thank you for that. If there are any questions that do come on after this webinar has ended, you can send them to our webinar account or tweet it out to us, and we have a good connection with Stephanie. We can pass along those questions, and if we get answers, we can add them to our concussion resources on our website, and even as a write-up or follow-up to this webinar.
And I'm just typing my email in. You guys can all still see my screen. If you guys have any further collaboration needs or anything like that, we work with a lot of organizations. We're working closely with Ontario Soccer, obviously. So there's my email if anyone has any further ideas on how, after today, on what would be best to ensure these things are implemented at their clubs or teams.
Perfect. So again, thank you so much, Stephanie, for taking this time and updating us and educating all of us on this. Again, thank you to everybody who did join in. And if there are no further questions, then we will end the webinar, and we look forward to our next edition to our webinar series.